Thank you, and thanks for giving me that opportunity to share with others, because that's what I really enjoy about this. So first of all, I've got a question for the audience, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, so this does not have to be a show of hands. How many have been involved in a project that did not go as well as planned, had some significant problems or even minor problems, or was an outright disaster? And more importantly, did you have, when that happened, did you have the nagging thought that there were some warning signs that either weren't paid attention to or weren't pursued as diligently as they could have been? Has anybody had that experience? Okay, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So we've had people talk about user testing. Robin's talk was great about that. Gian's talk, and workshop talked about user testing. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well, but with a specific focus on preventing problems, or more specifically, finding them early. Now, I like to bring examples from my life experience, so I'm going to apologize in advance for mixing my metaphors a little bit. I worked at Lockheed in the 90s, so I'm going to use a couple of Lockheed examples, but I'll get back to higher ed very quickly. So I don't know if anybody remembers the Mars Climate Orbiter that spectacularly crashed into the surface of Mars. Fantastic technical achievement, building this complex piece of equipment, testing it, everything works, flying it all the way to Mars, everything was great, then it crashed on the surface. And that had to do with user behaviors. One team was working in the metric system, one team was working in the imperial system. So that's, the relationship here is that it was in significant part due to user behavior. Now, fortunately, even though I was working at Lockheed, I was not on that project team. So, dodged a bullet there. Nobody found the problem in advance. Okay. Now, this is a project Lockheed was working on that my division was working on. I was specifically working on part of this project. And at that time, I was working not in design or user interface or anything like that. Supplier quality assurance. It was my job to go to our suppliers and look for problems. And I found a big-ish. I said ish because it could have become a big problem. Okay, so I was out in the field with our vendors, and I found this through what I thought was particularly diligent testing and digging into the software and things like that. And I was proud of myself. And I came back, I did my job well, so I was confused when, everybody was unhappy with me. I had killed the production schedule. I had, found a problem with something engineering had done and so on. So there were a lot of people unhappy with me, even though I had done my job. So I thought, Gian said it very well yesterday when she said, sometimes you have to tell your client their baby is ugly. When you have to highlight problems in other people's work sometime, and that can be challenging. Why is that? It's because people like positive reinforcement. They like positive results. They like it when things go well. Our budgeting and planning are typically on best case scenarios. How many of you are familiar with that? Right? Okay. So that's why everybody likes positive results. But what I'm here to tell you today is that got my slides out of sequence. Well, okay. I'll save the punchline for a minute. But we have to be careful about all the ways we can fool ourselves. So there's probably a few of you in the room here that are familiar with the cognitive bias codex. That's this diagram over here. It's probably pretty faint. You're not going to be able to read that. That's because it's cramming in like 180 or so different mental models that humans use that are great. That's how we get through the day, making a lot of assumptions and working on patterns that we've recognized elsewhere. Okay, but that pattern recognition does not always work to our advantage. I'm going to talk about one in particular, confirmation bias. So typically we tend to undervalue what the facts say and overvalue those facts that happen to coincide with what we think or the way we want the world to be. And then actually sometimes we blindly stick to what we want things to be rather than what the facts say. And that's called confirmation bias. You're probably all familiar with that. And this translates very often in our world to designers, developers looking for positive reinforcement. How much do you love this thing I made? How many of you have seen user testing that was basically like that? Okay. I see some heads nodding. Okay. And what I'm here to tell you today, now I can get to my punchline. Negative results can save a project. Okay. It's just a question of when and how you find them. All right. And the slide deck will be posted. So, you're welcome to take pictures, but you don't have to. So I've got an example. Negative examples, the clients will remain nameless. So right now, this is a quote from a client who came to us. We call the new partner and manually walk them through the portal interface. They had designed a portal for a particular subset of their clients, and it was so complicated and difficult to navigate. And by the way, these were developers, these were not unintelligent people, that it was so hard for them to navigate through it, and the failure rate was so high, they just called them and said, we're going to schedule a call and we'll walk you through it. So they came to us and said, look, we need some UX help on this new partner portal. Sometimes you need to tell me to slow down and enunciate. And that's what we did. We worked with them on that. So we want to talk about how to find failures early in a structured way. Okay. So I'm going to talk about 2 case studies. I'll warn you, some of these slides look very busy. That's just because they're examples. We're not going to go through all the report details for that client because you don't care. We're going to be talking about the process of what we did. So the first case study is going to be kind of the usual, what most of us think of when we think of user testing, and that's testing the interface. How does this button work? How does this labeling work, the placement, and so on. The second one is going to be, I think, a little bit more interesting and relevant, and that's testing a value proposition, which has a few particular key considerations that are different. So this one is for a project we're currently working with a university school of pharmacy redesign. Okay, so it's the typical marketing approach. How do we put our best foot forward? How do we recruit, high quality candidates? How do we convince them to apply here instead of elsewhere? The typical kinds of things. So one of the things that my group was doing, I don't think I mentioned that. So I lead. Oh, I should have done this. So I work for Atlantic BT, a software and web development agency. I don't work for a university. We have several universities as clients. And I lead what we call the experience group. So that includes business analysis, information architecture, user research, user experience design, visual design. So as a part of the project, we went through and we wanted to identify what was appropriate topic grouping, topic labeling, design usability, those kinds of things that we wanted to test. So the methods we used were things like card sort, tree test, usability test. I'm not going to talk about how to go through and figure out the appropriate testing process for a particular project. It varies, depending on the needs. But I just want to go through a few examples here. So we did a card sort, and I'm going to assume that most people here are familiar with the card sort, so I'll cover it very quickly. Just think of like an index card on a table, a bunch of index cards. You have different people group them in terms of how they would bunch them together. So you can see people's mental models for what they think associates with other things, and you can combine inputs from multiple people to figure out your navigation, basically. And what we did was we did this via online. This is a Hangout session. The top right is one of my team members here who's performing that test. And then they come up with their groupings of the various topics. And all of these would look familiar to you. Again, we're not going to go through the specifics of this particular report. And the research takeaway is that we found that our participants consistently created very similar categories. So the results were that we could plan logical sections using the card sort, and we had a first draft of a new site structure. Now, this talk is about failures and negative results, right? But there were no real negative results here because this was what we call generative research, not evaluative. So you wouldn't expect negative results here. But then after you've built that kind of a structure, you can move on to something that's evaluative. In this case, a tree test. And it's, you think of trees and branching, and you give people a task, and you see, which path did they follow to try and achieve that task, and whether they went through the appropriate path or not, which will tell you whether the path was clear, your labeling was clear, the groupings made sense to them, and so on. And so we performed the tree test. In this case, we had 68 participants taking a 5-minute test. You can use tools online for this. We used Optimal Sort for this, I believe. And it allows you to find potential problems early to inform the design. Now, when you do this, this is evaluative research. You can start finding problems. And this is an example where there's a lot of red and yellow in the pie chart. Obviously, this one did not go well, this particular task. So we asked them how to find a particular topic. We found that most users were struggling to find the target link. And so the recommendation was to increase the visibility of that opportunity within that particular section of the website. So this was informing design. Again, this is before any code is written, so it's relatively low on the investment scale in terms of time and effort you've put into it. So this was evaluative research, so you can expect some failures or negative results here. I would even go so far to say is, if you don't find failures in your user testing, you're not testing very well, okay? Because it's impossible to figure out, I see heads nodding, yeah, you're not going to be able to figure out how everyone is going to respond. But you can find things and start correcting them before design gets too far down the road. And then once you have a design, then you can do some usability testing, and you don't have to have the code written, the site developed to do this. You can use a clickable prototype. So here we have a high fidelity comp. And this is where I think it's getting a little bit interesting. The more of the interface you have, the more testing you can do. So what I want to show here is that we had a first impression task, okay, just a first impression, kind of a 5-second impression test of what do you think is going on here. 4 information seeking tasks for the different user groups, a very brief post-task survey for each one, and then an overall post-test survey, okay, and then a post-test interview. So these are multiple techniques that allow us to provide both quantitative and qualitative information, or to obtain that kind of information. We had 2 different groups. One is prospective students. That's one of the things that we talk about. It's come up in a few of the talks. You've got multiple user groups. Which one's most important? Well, it depends on the context, what you're building, who you're building it for, and so on. So we split up into these 2 groups, both basically external and internal. And we set up a bunch of tasks for them. And again, this is where I said, don't worry, we're not going to go through the whole slide. This is to talk about the process, not the details. But we identified tasks for each group, and that's what we were using to test them with. And then, as you would expect, hopefully, if you've done a good job, you do receive a lot of positive results on those, both on the pie chart of the success and also the results of the questionnaire. We were looking at their feedback on ease, time spent, support information. These were the very quick kind of Likert scale responses. So it's quick and easy, and you don't get survey fatigue from your participants. We get the qualitative information in the interview after that. And then looking at group 2, this is an example of where we found a failure. Okay, obviously looking at the pie chart, a lot of red and yellow, didn't go very well. The post-task questionnaire scores are much lower, and that's where the interview comes in, finding out why those things went wrong. So again, a lot of bullet points here. The individual bullets aren't the point. These were like the validations. What we found were things that we're doing right. Notice that we did put where we found that information. So this answers one of the questions that came up in one of the workshops, I forget which one, about how do we communicate these things to our stakeholders. You'll notice some of these slides are in a different format. They were extracted from a report presentation. We used to provide long reports, kind of very academic looking, paper type things, but we found that when we made it more of a presentation, it was easier for people to absorb. If you've ever used optimal sort and looked at kind of the dendrogram results and things like that, they're very hard to understand, very hard to explain. What we found was we would extract elements of those, that's basically what these pie charts are, and explain them individually. Again, that usability, how easy is it for our client to consume that information? That's one tip is, think of that as a presentation just like any other. So we identified the validations, cool, great, good job team, but then we identified the problems that we needed to work on. And again, where those can come from, whether it was the task tests, the interviews, card sorts, tree tests, things like that. So again, most of our design approach was validated, which is great. But we did identify clear needs for improvement. And the cool thing is we haven't written any code yet. So in terms of tight budgets and optimal use of your investments, I am an advocate for testing early. So testing the user interface is great, okay? And that's what a lot of us are familiar with here. But I would say that testing the user interface is not enough. In some cases, if it's a marketing site that's been up for years and it's working pretty well, you don't want to radically change things and risk breaking it, okay? Then testing tweaks to the interface is fine. But if you're building something new, if you're building a new portal, a new functionality, then it's important to test something else. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Again, back from my Lockheed days, this was a stakeholder talking about a new initiative that he wasn't in favor of, and he said, a bad idea, beautifully executed, is still a bad idea. Kind of like all the phrases we have for things like, putting lipstick on a pig, polishing a turd, things like that. You just can't turn a bad idea into a good idea by making it pretty. So what we want to do is test not only the interface, but the viability of the value proposition. Okay, so back to the title of the talk, failure. If the interface is wrong, then you're going to have failures of tasks, of completion, high abandonment rates, things like that. Those are bad, but it's not as bad as a complete concept failure of what you were trying to do. So this is the second case study I want to talk about a little bit. So we work with North Carolina State University, very happy to be partners with them, and they're a great team to work with. They come to us most often not for a complete handoff of you do the complete project. They typically come to us for, look, we've got developers, we've got expertise in these areas, but we don't have UX design people on our staff. We don't have researchers on our staff. Can you help us in that area? So we basically form a joint team to accomplish these projects. So they wanted to build something, a new syllabus tool. So this was going to be a new functionality so this was faculty oriented to build their syllabi. I guess I never took Latin, but wouldn't that be the plural of syllabus? So the challenge here was to achieve business goals that are in conflict with long-established user behaviors. How many of you have ever been in a case like that where you knew the user wasn't going to be enthused about what you're trying to do? Okay. So, and we know that sometimes faculty resist change. So I see nodding heads. Brian got a laugh when he mentioned this, so I asked him if I could steal it, and he said, sure. So I'm just quoting Brian from yesterday, stating the obvious. So when we were going through our typical research process of interviewing stakeholders, what they were looking at was they have changing requirements to receive their accreditation, in terms of what must be in a syllabus, and how those change over time. They wanted to be able to incorporate those changes, and they wanted a more modern and responsive workflow and presentation and user interface. Okay, those are typical business level objectives. And then at the user level, they had task objectives in terms of, well, we need to allow people to roll over a syllabus they've already created from previous semesters, and being flexible for the needs of all kinds of different departments. The design department and engineering department may have some radically different sections of their syllabus and so on and so forth. Again, we don't need to worry about the details of those. The point is, there were different sets of objectives, okay? Oh, and I want to go back to, so display a more modern and responsive visual and workflow presentation. We're all in this room familiar with that phrasing, right? But I love how one of the stakeholders on the team said, well, gee, people said modern and responsive. They were using the buzzwords, but do you think they really meant easy to use? Okay. We can get so wrapped up in our jargon that we know what that means, but from a user perspective, they just want it to be easy. And the tricky bit is knowing what easy means to them. Okay. So here the research questions were, we wanted to test the interface, of course. We wanted to test the workflow, especially new because this was a new tool. Everybody before this was developing their own syllabus. They didn't have a standardized tool for doing it. And we wanted to validate the value proposition. So the research methods we used were to do stakeholder interviews, as we always start with understanding the business objectives. Some focus groups with faculty and staff to understand their concerns. Paper prototyping, which we're going to show in just a minute. And then developing a service blueprint to kind of map out the process to help us isolate elements and think about it. So paper prototyping, and again, I think Robin mentioned that in her talk, paper prototyping is great in that it doesn't cost a lot of money. You don't have to write code and build the system. So what you see here is this is not stock photos or anything. This is pictures from our test. Very, very simple, basic paper prototyping. It's like, okay, you click this button, you get this drop-down menu, right? Or you get this modal, things like that. So, and it can be very effective testing, and that's exactly what we did. And the observations were that the faculty were able to use the proposed interface, so they could use it, but they strongly preferred to use Google Docs, for example. Okay, so there's a difference between ability and motivation there. And this is what I thought was very interesting. So the UX researcher said, I was terrified to present the results. This is, I've got to go tell my client that their baby's ugly or this is a bad idea, but I'm going to put an asterisk by that. Okay, just hold the asterisk there. But this indicates that people are reluctant to deliver negative results, and we have to be careful. Now, we did this because that's our job. That's what research and user testing does. Okay, so we're used to standing up and being a designated spear catcher because that's our job. But a lot of people are reluctant to the point of not letting that happen, and it's not just on the end of the people delivering the news. I'm not trying to put the onus on anybody on this room. It's also reluctance of people to hear it, even if you say it. Okay, so going back to the stakeholders, but they were aware of this. Again, we love working with the NCSU team. They're great. They said if the faculty don't adopt the system, then the project will be a failure. And this will be directly related both to the usability and how we internally present the system. So it's great to work with a client that's self-aware. So there was a clear need to test the value proposition. And that's what we did. So when you get negative results like that, when you get people saying, I don't like this idea, does that mean you do nothing? Do you say testing showed that people don't like this idea? How many people think you do nothing? Okay, no show of hands. That's good. You knew it was a trick question. You have to be careful, be wary of effective forecasting. So if you remember that big chart of the cognitive bias codex, okay, effective forecasting is one of those areas. It's a problem. It's because that's a phrase that means people are bad at estimating how hypothetical situations will affect them in the future. And we can't let this stop progress, okay? And just as one little example, everybody knows this meme. This is overestimating the positive impact of a change in relationship or something like that. Similarly, we overestimate negative impacts. Okay? So how do we get around that? Well, instead of asking what questions, ask why questions. Understand the motivations of what they're trying to achieve, what their pain points are, why are they doing this, not the mechanics of how they're doing it. So one of the tools that we used is we developed a service blueprint, and I know you can't read that, and it's intentional because the details don't matter. If you're not familiar with a service blueprint, it's the individual steps through a process with swim lanes for what are the user actions, what is the front stage in terms of their interface and the tools they're using, what's backstage in terms of the integrated systems, things like that, what has to go on in the background, and then what supports behind that that may even be manual processes, for example. So focus on why questions, and that's how you innovate. So we know people don't like it when you move their cheese, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a better place or way to deliver their cheese, okay? You think about the big innovations going from horse transportation to automotive transportation, the radical innovations of the Apple products, what was the music player? iPod, thank you. I'm not an Apple guy. iPod, the iPhone, and so on. I think it's a misquote, but when attributed to Henry Ford when he said he was reputed to have said, and again I think it's a misquote. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Okay, what they wanted was really to get somewhere else faster. That's their motivation. That's the why question. A horse versus a Model T was the how question. Same thing with Apple. They didn't ask, do you want a smaller LP turntable or more lightweight Sony Walkman? Do you want portability of music and things like that? And how can we deliver that? So focusing on those why questions is really what helps you motivate. And the only way to understand somebody's motivators is through user research. So as a result of this test, we had a simplified interface, okay, through the kind of the standard user interface testing, but based on the value proposition results, basically that qualitative information we got from the interviews and focus groups and things like that, we changed the plan from a big bang release to a phased release. And we set up alpha and beta testing groups, okay, to ease the transition. So, of course, graduate students get abused. Graduate students will be entering the syllabi of the new system, and they'll be focusing on, we're using them to test the interface. Okay, they'll find the bugs and things like that so they can do that, and we won't annoy faculty. If you attended the talk on institutions, there's a reason we call them institutions. And he talked about how you've got somebody who spent 10 years becoming an expert in a thing. They're reluctant to go through training on a new system, right? But the faculty will review the resulting syllabi, and they will be testing the value proposition in terms of the end result. Okay, this provides the information I want. It also meets the university requirements and so on. So it will ease that transition. So the results are that the alpha phase was successful. It's now in the development for the beta testing. So I can't give the final results because this is in progress right now. But I think just in terms of the way the university team is approaching it, that it has a very high chance for success. And oh, by the way, in terms of the community, my understanding is that they intend for this to be an open source tool that they want to share with others as soon as it's developed. And so, keep your eyes out and attuned to the North Carolina State University folks here in WP Campus. I'm sure they can give you an update on that next year. So user research led to a leaner, lower risk approach. So, we talk a lot about tight budgets, and that's a reality. The testing methods that we used can be very inexpensive using Google Hangouts. If you've got a list of email addresses, Hangouts doesn't cost you anything. It can be just basically your time, which I know is also in short supply. Things like using optimal sort for p-tests, okay, that's a tool that costs some money to subscribe to, but there are other ways to do it. And then paper prototyping, again, you can just draw it out and test it. And I think Robin talked about that in her talk. That's something you can do for the cost of a coffee. So one of the things I wanted to point out is user experience and design serves two masters. And we talk an awful lot, we focus on users. It's in the name. U in UX is for users, right? And we focus so much on the users. And whether you want to call them users, customers, humans, the labeling for my point here is not terribly important. But they are users of something. It's always in relation to a provider of that product or a service or whatever. So that value proposition is crucial in terms of mapping their tasks, the user tasks, their pain points, the gains you want to deliver to them against the features and functionality that's going to provide that. Now, this is from a tool that I use called the Value Proposition Canvas. So who's providing that value? Well, they're typically paying our paychecks one way or the other, okay? So this is another tool that I use. This is the Lean Canvas by Ash Maurya. It's built on top of the work of Alex Osterwalder's business model canvas. I use it quite a lot in terms of understanding what an organization is trying to deliver in terms of, this is basically the user portion, this is the solution portion, this is the kind of the business portion here. And the point to this is to understand the holistic view of what the organization is trying to achieve, because if the business model fails, the user gets nothing, okay? And again, we may be able to think of a few examples where that's happened. So the key takeaways for me to give you today are: plan for testing and iteration. If you don't plan for failure, failure will happen unplanned. It's just a question of how big those will be in impact. Smile and don't groan at test failures. You just learned something valuable, okay? You maybe even prevented a disaster. It's a shame we can't go down alternate timelines and say, if you don't listen to me, this disaster is going to happen, okay? I'm waiting for the picture of this. Take negative feedback to heart. If it's hard to hear, you really need to listen, okay? And for people who are creating things, designers, developers, and people like that, it can be hard sometimes because we can invest in our babies, what we've built. So think about that. Whenever your initial response is to say, well, that's not right because, that's your trigger to pause and listen again. And think about value to your stakeholders as much as to your users. Back to that quote of, a bad idea beautifully implemented is still a bad idea. So now to go back to my crazy examples, you were wondering why were we looking at spacecraft and tanks in this higher education talk. So the one I found with the Bradley fighting vehicle, we fixed it so there was no disaster, okay? Which could have been really bad on a battlefield. People could literally have died if the product did not perform as it was supposed to. So I'm still proud of the fact that there was no news, nothing spectacular, because, a year or two before. Oh, and so the BFV means Bradley Fighting Vehicle. This is not really a tank, it's an armored infantry vehicle. And after Operation Desert Storm, they were so happy with the product, they came to us to tell us how it performed in the field. okay, which just made us really, really happy. And again, it's one of those things where I would shudder to look down alternate timelines. I was just very glad to hear that they were very, very happy. And that made the fact that the production line was unhappy with me a year or two before a much smaller problem. So I've got like 10 more minutes, I think. So I've got to have a couple of bonus slides, and I'll come back to this. So who sets the business model, and what does this mean for them? This is from a CSX customer satisfaction survey, and this question is, do we understand the journey? The question was, we have a deep understanding of our customer's journey across all touch points, online and offline. So it's a Likert scale response, and we've got a pretty normal distribution here, just a little bit skewed positive, all except for the red bar. Can you guess who the red folks are? They are the executives, the ones that everybody is afraid to give bad news to. They were strongly skewed towards, oh yeah, we understand the customer's journey. We don't need to do any more work, okay? So this is where it can get very crucial in terms of standing up, delivering that negative feedback, helping them to understand what it means, because the natural organizational inclination is to shield executives from bad news. This is basically kind of a rewording of the same question. Does our customer experience need improvement? Pretty much everybody was sloping to the right, yes, and the executives were pretty much there too, except for the strongly agree. They were like half of everybody else in terms of saying, I strongly agree that we need to improve our customers' experience. Okay. And this is just anybody in here from NC State? Yeah, so you recognize the hallway there, the Delta team. So this is just a toss-away image where we put up the initial mock-ups of the workflow for Lou wanted his entire team to be able to see it and comment on it, and so we've got Post-its all over it, and we just love that kind of feedback from lots and lots of people. It was in the hallway, you know, they could comment on it. So I wanted to finish in time for some questions. We got time for a few questions.
So I heard about that Bradley project in my project management and business analysis class.
Oh, really?
Yes.
What did you hear?
That it was, it costs a lot of money.
Well, weapon systems do tend to cost a lot of money. So the value proposition for the Bradley, it was lightly armored, so its defense was speed. But then to be able to fire at speed, you need to have an inertially stabilized turret. So actually, in a different iteration of this, I've got a little video where it's driving around and the gun's just bam, 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 firing rounds. It's a smaller gun. It fires depleted uranium rounds that deliver high kinetic energy. And some of the stories they told us was they're faster than the M1A1 Abrams. So they were able to engage enemy tanks before our tanks did, and they took out a lot of the Soviet-make T-72s that the Iraqis were using. So yeah, that's a long explanation of, yeah, it gets expensive to build an inertially stabilized turret for something that's moving quickly and so on.
They used it as an example of a lot of stakeholder input and changing of requirements. So
okay.
They had mentioned that a lot of people wanted it to do a lot of things.
Right. On one of my testing runs, I got to sit in one, and it was kind of like a video game experience. It's like you click and the turret moves, double click, it goes faster, push this button, the rocket launcher flips out. Any other questions? No? Oh, yes.
Any advice for working with executives that are reluctant to hear any feedback?
Yes. So one of the things is, a few things. So I mentioned already that don't give them a long report, you know. Especially in the academic world, we tend to get into this long, I've got to build my case, I've got to show all the research methodology, I've got to do all the analysis, and the results are buried at the end. Okay, you've got to flip that for executives. You've got to show them the results. Then you can have as backups how you got there, because you do need to prove a little credibility. It is, I think I mentioned earlier this weekend that it is fantastic to have recordings of users failing at a task, because that so much changes the conversation from I'm an expert and you need to listen to me to, hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Watch the user struggle with this thing. That is hugely valuable. Simplifying the presentation, like I was talking about, kind of the slide deck method, a lot of visualizations, charts and graphs that are very clear. One topic at a time, only talk about one thing. Like I mentioned, the dendrograms from tree tests can just be so complicated to explain, and you're doomed to failure if you try and use that. Isolate individual nuggets of information from that. Using a third party, this sounds a little bit self-serving because I work for an agency, but it is very much our role sometimes to be the bad guy. We all know what's the phrase? The prophet in their own land is not heard. Familiarity breeds contempt. Like, well, why? I see you every day, so your opinion, so what? But we've paid these people to do an analysis, and they're experts. So sometimes it can help to bring in that outside opinion, and it could be internally. With universities on the NC Delta team, they have a fellow who's got a PhD in human-computer interaction. So it's great to say, well, expertise on your team says this, so you can do that. I think that's it for my quick points. Does that help? Anything else? I think we've got 5, maybe 4 now minutes left.
Do you ever have to convince a client that they need to do UX, or? Yes,
sadly, we do have to try and convince that very often, because as we talked about, budgets and timelines are best case scenarios. So I just need a thing. I want you to build the thing. I don't have money for testing the thing, and it really is hard to make that cost avoidance argument. Gian mentioned several of those examples, and those can be very helpful if you can have those, but cost avoidance is predicting alternate timelines, so it's challenging. But yeah, we do have to do that very often. That's why I was focusing on trying to keep the testing methods as inexpensive as possible. Anything else? So I just want to say thank you. I have really learned a lot at this this conference. I appreciate the ability to share what I've learned with you. I hope it was useful for you. Take advantage of the contact information. If you have any other questions later, ask them online and I will get back to you. So really enjoyed it and look forward to the remaining talks.